I'm Dr. David Clark. I lecture in theology at the University of Roehampton in London. The title of this podcast is Theology and Identity. In this current series, we're utilizing the hermeneutical framework of narrative theology to explore the Old Testament, seeking to better understand the interaction between Israel's beliefs about God and the way they understood themselves. In this current episode, we're asking the question, what did it mean to be quote-unquote saved in the Old Testament? We find ourselves in the book of 1 Samuel. We know that Yahweh has called the people of Israel to live in covenant relationship with Him, so that through them the nations can receive the blessing that had been promised to Abraham. The only problem that we've seen so far is that the people of Israel are having a really hard time keeping that covenant. In fact, they're not even close. So at this point in the narrative, the question has arisen, will a king be the answer? And now as we're working our way through 1 Samuel, we look at the life of Saul, and we want to know, will he be the kind of king, the kind of leader that will unite the 12 tribes and bring about spiritual renewal in the land? This is what we, the readers, are hoping to see. And I think we all agree that if Saul is going to be the man who leads Israel back to covenant faithfulness, then he better be a godly man himself. So here is where we come to a really interesting question about the theology of the Old Testament. What did it really mean to be saved or right with God? Let's begin by addressing what it didn't mean. First of all, being saved had nothing to do with the idea of going to heaven. In fact, at this moment in Israel's history, they're not really sure about what happens after you die. They haven't really articulated the idea of resurrection. There's certainly no concept of eternal life in God's presence or eternal suffering in hell. We'll come back to this in a later podcast, but for now we'll note that in early Hebrew thought, this idea of being saved was not about the hope of quote-unquote going to heaven. Second, if you were born into the 12 tribes of Israel, there was really no apparatus for personal conversion. Being a member of the chosen people of Israel wasn't something that came by a decision or a personal commitment. You were just born into it. If you were a male, you were of course circumcised as a symbol of belonging to the covenant, but this wasn't considered a moment of salvation. Your membership in the nation of the elect came automatically to you by birth as a descendant of Abraham. So, if it wasn't about going to heaven, and it wasn't about following certain steps to get saved, what did it mean to be saved among the people of Israel? Was the emphasis just on keeping the rules of the Torah, or was there a more subjective, personal element of having relationship with God? The answer is that the idea of personal relationship with Yahweh did exist. We've seen this, for example, in the story of Moses, where the text says that he knew God face to face. But the question we want to pursue is, how exactly did someone obtain this level of personal relationship, and how did they lose it? What we'll discover is that there are beautiful nuances and subtleties in Hebrew religious thought, and the story of Saul really provides some interesting insights. So let's look at his life. When the narrative of Saul begins, we the readers have a favorable impression of him. When the prophet Samuel told him that he would be king, he protested that he was a nobody and that he didn't deserve this honor. In chapter 10, as Samuel anointed him, he said, "Has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies." Samuel then prophesied that Saul would receive a sign of the Lord's favor. "Then the Spirit of the Lord will rush upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and be turned into another man. Now when these signs meet you, do what your hands find to do, for God is with you." The narrative in chapter 10 then concludes saying that when Saul turned back to leave Samuel, God gave him another heart. So Saul gets off to a great start. As we read on, we see that the Spirit of God comes upon him in powerful ways. God speaks to him in times of need and regularly demonstrates that Saul is his anointed, the one whom he has appointed to lead the people of Israel. Saul was very effective at unifying the 12 tribes of Israel, and he led them in numerous victories over their enemies. He did something that no other leader in Israel had managed to do. He successfully established the 12 tribes of Israel as a kingdom and a force to be reckoned with in the region. Saul led Israel for some 25 years, but as we read through the chapters that tell his story, we come to the point where it becomes clear that his personal connection with Yahweh has been broken. In chapter 28 it says, "Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him." Later in chapter 28, we read that Saul tried desperately to restore his previous sense of connection with God. As he prepared for battle against the Philistines, he cried out for help. He prayed for dreams, he consulted the prophets, he tried the Urim and Thummim, which might have been something like dice that priests would roll to get an answer from God, but none of this worked. God was simply not speaking to him. And so Saul decided to consult with a witch who lived in a place called Endor, asking for her to consult the dead on his behalf. So what happened to Saul? How did he go from being a man with a transformed heart and power from God's Spirit to the place where he's kind of a wacko, tormented by an evil spirit, blocked off from communication from God, and turning to necromancy? There's a simple, superficial answer to this question, and then there's a more nuanced, complex answer. Let's start with the simple, superficial answer. In this case, Saul was rejected by God because he had disobeyed Samuel's instructions. The first account of this disobedience is found in chapter 13. Samuel had given Saul some very specific instructions about a sacrifice that was to be made. He said to Saul, "Go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I am coming down to you to offer burnt offerings and to sacrifice peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait until I come to you and show you what you shall do." So Saul went to Gilgal, and here's what the narrative says. He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me, and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and greet him. Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, Now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself, and I offered the burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." According to Samuel, Saul had sinned, and as a consequence, God would not give him a lasting dynasty. He offered the sacrifice himself, and thus, according to Samuel, he had disobeyed the commandment of God. But at this point, it seems that God has not altogether abandoned Saul. In the next chapter, Saul calls upon Yahweh, and Yahweh answers. So it doesn't seem that Saul has lost completely his connection with God, yet. The next incident of disobedience comes in chapter 15. Through Samuel, God gives Saul very specific instructions to wipe out the people of Amalek. He says, "Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." This is presented in the text as God's act of vengeance against Amalek for the way that they had opposed the 12 tribes of Israel as they came out of Egypt. So Saul obeyed, but not completely. He destroyed some of the city, but not all of it, and he spared the king, the best animals, and quote-unquote, all that was good. So once again, it seems that Saul has disobeyed. He did not specifically and thoroughly carry out the commands that God had given to him. Samuel confronted him, saying, "The Lord anointed you king over Israel, And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, Go, devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. I have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have devoted the Amalekites to destruction. But the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the best of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. And Samuel said, Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore please pardon my sin and return with me that I may bow before the Lord. And Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. So in the narrative, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. It seems that there's no hope for Saul, and in the next chapter, God sends Samuel to anoint the next king of Israel, who is a young man named David. So again, how did Saul go from being chosen and anointed by God to being tormented by an unclean spirit? The simple, superficial answer is that God had rejected Saul because he had disobeyed the rules. He'd been given a command to wait 7 days for Samuel at Gilgal, who would come to offer a sacrifice, but he didn't wait. He offered the sacrifice himself. He broke the rules. And then God had told him to completely wipe out the Amalekites, but again, he disobeyed. He didn't follow God's commands, and as a result, God punished him. So this all fits very nicely with the traditional framing of the Old Testament God. He gives commands, and anyone who disobeys is punished. It puts Yahweh into that place of being a rule maker, who gives mandates that at some times seem random or arbitrary, or in this case even inhumane. But it doesn't matter what people think about these commands. It's their job simply to obey and not ask questions. If you challenge God, if you question the command, and if you don't follow it to the letter, then you will be punished. So in this scenario, Saul lost his salvation because he disobeyed. But if we look a bit more closely at the narrative, we discover that the real story is something much more complex and nuanced. What I want to argue is that this picture of Yahweh as being the capricious, tyrannical rule maker who ruthlessly punishes disobedience to his commands is not entirely accurate. Now, Saul initially had a connection with God and then he lost it. But why he lost it is about something much deeper than disobedience. As we look at the character of Yahweh in the narrative, we discover that he is actually quite tolerant of things not being done exactly the right way. His commandments were clear, but there were plenty of instances where good men didn't strictly follow these rules, and Yahweh didn't punish them and cast them off as a result. To see this dynamic, all we have to do is look at the life of Samuel, which parallels the story of Saul. There were elements in Samuel's practices that were contrary to God's commands, but for some reason, he never lost his relationship with Yahweh as a result. First of all, we've seen that Samuel scolded Saul for offering the sacrifice. But this leads to a deeper question. Why was Samuel offering sacrifices? The Torah is very clear that the offering of sacrifices is for the descendants of Levi, the priests. And 1 Samuel chapter 1 is pretty clear that Samuel was not a Levite, but rather he was from the tribe of Ephraim. So why is he functioning as a priest when technically he's not supposed to be doing this? But even more troubling is the place where Samuel offers sacrifices. He seems to be breaking one of the most important commands that Yahweh had given to the people of Israel in the Sinai desert. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, Moses had given clear instructions to the people about where they were supposed to offer sacrifices. The text says, "But you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go." And then a bit further down in the narrative it says, "And when he gives you rest from all your enemies around, so that you live in safety, then to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes, the contribution that you present, and all your finest vow offerings that you vow to the Lord." So the Torah is very clear. There's one and only one place where Israel can offer sacrifices. This was supposed to happen in the tabernacle, which was to be located exactly where God would indicate. The Canaanites worshipped at what the Bible calls high places, and the Hebrew word for this is bamah. In Numbers chapter 35, before they came into the land of promise, God had commanded them to destroy these high places. The Israelites were not to offer sacrifices anywhere and everywhere, and they certainly were not to offer sacrifices on the high places. Their place for offering sacrifices was in the tabernacle. Now, when Samuel was born, the tabernacle was in Shiloh, and it was overseen by the Levite priest Eli. We presume that at this time, Shiloh was the place that Yahweh had indicated for the location of the tabernacle. But just as Samuel was starting his prophetic ministry, the tabernacle in Shiloh was destroyed by the Philistines. Eli died, and his sons were killed in battle, and Israel was left without a place to offer sacrifices and without priests to officiate. What becomes clear in the narrative is that the prophet Samuel started to fill this gap. He officiated the sacrifices, and he did this in a very unconventional location, on a bamah, a high place. It's funny that the author of 1 Samuel seems rather embarrassed about all of this. He won't tell us exactly where this high place is, other than that it's located in the land of Zuph, whatever that means. It's inside of a city, and an analysis of the text indicates that it was a formal structure. We learn in 1 Samuel 9 that Samuel presided over the sacrifices on this high place, and he even invited Saul to share with him in a post-sacrifice meal. So what exactly was this high place? The Anchor Bible Dictionary notes that this bamah was a sanctuary of some architectural sophistication, not too different from the sanctuary complex at Arad. Now, I've been to Arad, and I've been in this sanctuary, and I can say that it was a complex, well-built, and completely illicit place of worship. So, we see something really interesting here. Samuel, who was called to be a prophet, is breaking some really important rules from the Torah. He's not a Levite. He's not supposed to be offering sacrifices. And if he does offer sacrifices, he's certainly not supposed to be doing this in a bamah, a high place that was supposed to be torn down. And one final note about Samuel. When he got old, he appointed his sons to take over his role as judge of Israel. But the text is clear that his sons were evil and corrupt, and apparently Samuel did nothing to correct them. Wasn't this the same sin as the priest Eli? Didn't God punish Eli because he didn't intervene to stop the wickedness of his children? Samuel was guilty in the same way, but the text makes no mention of any punishment for him. So why doesn't God reject Samuel the same way he rejected Saul and Eli? Why does it seem that God has so much tolerance for the mistakes and irregularities in the life and practice of Samuel, but he doesn't extend this same patience to others? The answer is really very simple. Samuel had a personal relationship with Yahweh. He was a friend of God. He understood God's heart. He understood God's mind. They talked, they commiserated, they shared each other's burdens. And Samuel cared about the things that God cared about. Throughout his life, Samuel carried a burden for the well-being of Israel. In his farewell address to the people, he said, "As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, and I will instruct you in the good and right way." So simply put, Samuel was a man who had a heart for God. And this was something that Saul never had. Not once in the narrative do we ever see Saul connecting emotionally with Yahweh. All he ever seeks from Yahweh is help to win his battles. There's no relationship, there's no love, there's no intimacy. Saul simply looks at Yahweh as a God who will help him achieve his own leadership aims. And this really is the crux of the conflict between Saul and Yahweh. Saul's way of ignoring God's commands was at the root of his downfall. But this isn't because Yahweh is a tyrant who demands strict obedience and who punishes any type of deviation from his rules. The root problem of Saul was not disobedience. The root problem with Saul was that he had no relationship with Yahweh. His disregard for God's commands was ultimately his way of showing Yahweh, "I don't know you, I don't care about you, and I just need you to help me achieve my goals." So what we're finding again in the Old Testament narrative is that what Yahweh really wants from the people of Israel is love relationship. Is this a surprise? Of course not. We already know that in the Shema, God had clearly said, "Love me with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might." So to get back to the original question, what did it mean to be saved in the Old Testament? The answer is this. To be saved meant to live an intimate love relationship with Yahweh. Part of showing this to God meant following his commands. But there are several examples of people, like Samuel, who were a bit irregular in their adherence to these rules. But because that relationship was in place, God didn't reject them. So if we ask what's more important to Yahweh, strict obedience to the rules or love relationship, he'll take the relationship every time. And that's our final thought for today. In our next episode, we'll continue this exploration of what Yahweh is really looking for as we take a look at the life of David. I'm Dr. David Clark. I lecture at the University of Roehampton in London, and I hope you'll join me again on this podcast, Theology and Identity.